Hey, welcome back everybody. Okay, so with this video, the main thing I want to do is just review who Levi-Strauss was and what his whole plan with Oedipus was, what his way of analyzing that myth was. Because that's kind of the one that he used as an example for his whole methodology, and it's a pretty good one for us for looking at what kind of things he likes to do and how he achieves it. So just to review, he was an anthropologist and also very interested in languages. There's a whole school of thought that's related to him, which is called structuralism, which uses languages to look at things like literature and mythology. And basically, he thought that myth was pretty similar to a language, especially in that, just as all the different words in a language are related to each other, you can't have just one word by itself. He felt you can't just have one myth by itself. They're all sort of in these interrelationships with each other. Near the very beginning of the class, we talked about myth as being a way that people sort of share values and communicate ideas. And so to do that, you kind of need to have all these different ideas interacting with each other and connecting with each other. And I think that's kind of what he's going for here, is that the different myths show different sides of everything and show sort of the whole package of the values of that culture. If you could look at all the myths that a given culture ever came up with, you would really deeply understand that culture. You would sort of have the whole picture. And Levi-Strauss says, if we want to understand what a myth like Oedipus is about, we have this weird myth about this weird situation. What is it about? Well, let's look at all these different myths, especially the ones that are connected to it, and let's look at all the different pieces within the myth itself, all the different parts. Like Prop, Levi-Strauss wanted to sort of boil the myth down into its most fundamental parts. Only where Prop had like specific events that could happen in lots of different stories, for Levi-Strauss, it's pieces of the story, like Oedipus fighting the Sphinx, or Oedipus's name, or something like that. So just to review, his methodology is to we have this terminology, synchronic versus diachronic. I think it's not super important for our purposes, but synchronic means looking at all the different things that happen at the same time. So it doesn't matter what order things happen to Levi-Strauss. So we should look at everything at the same time, whether it happens long ago or much more recently. Okay. So Levi-Strauss likes making charts like this one, and actually you can't see this super well. So let's go to the actual PowerPoint here. So his thing will be write down the different events or ideas from the myth on note cards, and then put them in a chart like this one. And the main thing you'll be doing is using your columns to talk about different subjects in the myth, different ideas, and then the rest, going down the rows here like this, will be telling the story in chronological order, what he calls diachronic. But these columns are basically synchronic, viewing things at the same time. Because up here we have the very beginning of the story, and even kind of the story of what happened to Oedipus's distant ancestor. And then we have things about Oedipus's father, and then we have things about Oedipus's descendants. So it all sort of works like that. So you read the myth, you make these note cards and put them in a chart like this one, and you find these different groupings. And then once you have the different groups, you see if there's any opposites that you can talk about. So that's the key to Levi-Strauss's whole chart here. Yeah, we're going to skip ahead here. Okay, so what subjects does he come up with? He comes up with the subjects of loving your family too much and killing your family. And he has the subjects killing monsters that come from the earth and people who have damaged feet. So one of our sets of opposites comes across pretty clearly here. This is loving your family too much and killing your family, or loving your family too little. So when you love your family too much, it might be something along the lines of incest, or it might be loving your family so much that you go against the gods or the kings. So things in this category, we have Oedipus marrying his mother, not good. Doesn't know she's his mother, but he's still loving his family when he shouldn't. Cadmus, Oedipus's ancestor, chasing after his sister when she was kidnapped by Zeus. You don't want that. You don't want to mess with Zeus. and Oedipus's daughter slash sister Antigone bearing her brother, even though her brother got into this big civil war and was a traitor to the city of Thebes. And so the current ruling power, her great uncle Cadmus, doesn't want her brothers to receive burial rites. So all these things have to do with loving your family when you shouldn't. And then you've also got the category of killing your family. Cadmus created these warriors by planting dragon's teeth, and they were known as the Spartoi. And then, even though they should be on the same side, they first started fighting each other and killing each other. Oedipus killed his father, told him to get out of the road. He wouldn't get out of the road. That was his father telling Oedipus to get out of the road. They didn't know each other, but they got into a fight and killed each other. And the brothers killing brothers. So all of those fit into those same categories. So Levi-Strauss is encouraging us basically to think, all these myths concern the royal family of Thebes. So there must be some connection there. Why are these same sort of topics coming up over and over again? Maybe the whole sort of set of myths has something to say about these topics. So Levi-Strauss talks about an idea of mediation, basically, that myths often look at the extreme ends of a society, or extreme ends of what people could do. Because myths are mostly, in a large part, about teaching people to uphold the values of their particular society, right? These are the values we were talking about. So if we look ahead here, what's in between loving your family to an unhealthy degree and murdering your family? Well, it's having normal family relationships. So, you treat your mother and father in a certain way. You don't kill them, you don't marry them. That seems pretty reasonable. And so on a big level, what the myth is saying is, hey, look, if we go against these values, and if we go too far to either one extreme or the other, we end up in a bad situation. We end up being punished by the gods for it, and our whole life falls apart, and then we blind ourselves, and the beautiful queen kills herself. Bad things happen. Levi-Strauss identifies these things that are in between. He calls them mediators because they kind of make peace with the different extremes. And usually what a mediator is something that upholds the current society. For instance, we could say, some sort of political thing that it's that to be too revolutionary is too, extreme, or to be too complacent with the way things are is too, is a bad idea. And so we might say in our movies or in our shows or in our stories, our modern version of myths, that we should be somewhere in between. And I think if you look at a lot of movies, you'll find that they do something pretty similar to that. Say, don't go too far to one side or the other. Of course, the Greeks absolutely loved this idea of being in between, not going too far to one side or the other. So it may be more of a specific thing to their culture than Levi-Strauss is willing to admit. But let's move back to the chart here. Go back to this chart. Okay, so we have these two categories here. But what about the other ones over here? This is where it gets weird. And this is where Levi-Strauss might or might not lose you. And certainly people have disagreed with him on this point. But I think there's something interesting here all the same. He notices that killing monsters that comes from the earth is sort of in opposition to the idea that human beings come from the earth. So in a lot of Greek mythology stories, human beings come from the earth. All these different little towns, Athens and Thebes, pretty much all of them, it seems like, have some sort of story where like this guy came out of the earth and he was like a snake and stuff, and then he was our ancestor or something like that. Here it's a dragon, and then you kill it, and then you get the Spartoi, these warriors who become the ancestors of the Thebans. So even in just the stories about Thebes, there's this whole thing about coming out of the earth. But it's weird then that monsters come from the earth too. So Levi-Strauss would say the Greeks felt this tension about this whole subject. Like, wait a minute, do we come from the earth, or do monsters come from the earth? Because when human beings don't come from the earth, the other explanation would be, they're born the way we're used to seeing people, from mothers and fathers. But isn't it interesting that we also have some discussion of mothers and fathers in this story? We have a lot of discussion of family. So it feels like Levi-Strauss is saying that the Greeks were worried about the difference between kind of having a family and the idea of monsters coming from the earth. Or do people come from the earth? And now he notices that these two categories are opposites. He argues that categories 3 and 4 are opposites as well, because he notices all of the men in Oedipus's family have something that seem to refer to being damaged in your feet, or walking with a limp. Oedipus, his name means swollen foot or wounded foot. His father, Laius, basically means something like lefty, so he was leaning towards his left side. And Labdacus, it was someone who was lame. He did walk with a limp. And this is Levi-Strauss's biggest jump. He says in mythology, there's a lot of stories where people come from the earth and then they walk with a limp for a little while. So he thinks that the Greeks may be connecting to some sort of idea that goes really far back in mythology about coming up out of the earth, because a lot of different mythologies have that, and walking with a limp when you're still walking around up there for the first time. So that would mean these two things are in opposition. We can say killing monsters that come from the earth, or good things like people come from the earth. So do people come from the earth, or monsters come from the earth? Now this is not really a problem you can really solve, because the mythology is inconsistent. Some mythology says that people are born of mothers and fathers, and also real life says that, and some mythology says people are born up out of the ground, or born from snakes who come up out of the ground, and things like that. So this is an inherent contradiction that is completely unsolvable. But Levi-Strauss says, what if we imagine something similar and solve that? And so we have this other pair of opposites, killing your family versus loving your family too much. We can solve that problem. How? By having normal human lives, playing by the rules of human society, not going too far to one extreme or the other. We can do something that's in the middle there. And when we tell the story of Oedipus, that's going to make us feel like everything's worked out with those two things. And so it's going to make us feel like everything's worked out with these two things as well. So it'll let us release that anxiety. And that was Levi-Strauss's big thing, is that mythology is about the anxieties we have as a society. And so telling these stories makes us feel like we understand what's going on, and that everything's going to be okay, because this is how the myth works, which is weird for such a dark myth where everything goes wrong. But, we're not doing any of that stuff. So things are going to be okay. And even this unsolvable problem, it's going to be okay. And one concept that he really refers to a lot is A is to B as C is to D. So this is like that in the same way that this is like that. So you could say up is the opposite of down, as left is the opposite of right. And that's kind of what he does with these things here. He says this is the opposite of this, in the same way that 3 is the opposite of 4. Incest is the opposite of family murder, in the same way that monsters come from the earth is the opposite of people come from the earth. Or to put it in a more opposite way, good things come from the earth versus bad things come from the earth. So that's a big idea there. And you see that in a lot of other settings as well, and I'm going to talk about that probably in the next video. But you can have something in between. So you can make little charts like this with Levi-Strauss too. See that these things are similar to each other. Loving your family, undervaluing your family, being born from the earth, being born from two parents, having damaged feet, and slaying monsters that come from the earth. They're all connected by being opposites. And the only thing that's really a mediator is this idea of a normal family. But that lets you feel like everything's worked out on the other levels as well. And he says there's sort of a logical leap that comes pretty naturally, because the whole issue is about family. So why not tell a myth about family, or many myths about family? And that's the last thing I want to emphasize here, is that there's lots of different myths that are involved in this whole series of myths. And Levi-Strauss would say, let's look at every different version of Oedipus too, because the different ways the Greeks tell it, the Romans tell it, the way we tell it, the way Sigmund Freud tells the story of Oedipus, all of that's going to say a lot. And only when you've looked at all of those, and he has a whole imaginary set of charts here, only when you've looked at all of the different versions of this chart that we could make, or let's say a lot of them, only then will you really understand the myth of Oedipus. You don't have to have infinite charts.